Welcome and thank you for attending. Questions can be asked using the questions pane in the webinar control panel. A copy of the handout can be found in the handout section of the webinar control panel. Today's presentation will be recorded. If you have any objection, you may disconnect at this time. I will now turn the presentation over to your presenter. You may begin.
Good afternoon, SHRM Long Island. This is Henry Shapiro. It is March 29th. I hope everybody is happy to be at the end of the month at the quarter mile point of the year and getting ready for what is supposed to be a sunny 60-degree day if you're on Long Island tomorrow. So with all that being said, I'm going to move pretty quickly into the material today because we have a lot to cover. It's about, for anybody who's been paying attention, I've done several of these New York City-centric webinars where we talk about laws that are not necessarily hitting us out here on the island in Nassau and Suffolk just yet, but typically things that we expect to see happening in the near or maybe even not so distant future. Because New York City sets the tone, Governor Cuomo picks it up, and then it becomes state law. Or something that, for instance, with the salary history ban, where it was started by Mayor de Blasio in the city, and then became an item for Westchester, and then it became an item for Suffolk County starting in June. I know I presented on that a couple of months ago. So Nassau has still managed to hide under the radar, but these lactation room requirements that have come out have rocked the world of some employers who are smaller workforces and not quite sure how to handle them. But for larger employers, many have already adopted because of prior New York State laws regarding lactation rooms. Depending on the diversity of your workforce, I think will determine how much this is actually going to impact you on a day-to-day basis. But luckily enough, it is for New York City only at this point in time. It is something that us on Long Island can plan for, something we can get ahead of. Jackson Lewis already adopted a similar lactation policy internally, so we can be ready in the event that this ever becomes a statewide law, or at least a Nassau and Suffolk law. So why are we here? So just about 2 weeks ago, March 18th, all New York City employers with at least 4 employees must provide a written policy on employee lactation accommodation rights. What does that written policy also require? It requires that you have a lactation room. If you are unable to provide one, I will clue you in. It is a high threshold to meet that standard. But if you're unable to provide one, there are ways you can, quote unquote, get out of it. But it is not easy, nor is it meant to be easy, because New York City wants to force people to comply. Why is this law somewhat familiar to some people? Well, New York State has its Section 206C of the labor law, which I quoted it there for you. We don't have to read it, but you can look at that middle line. The employer, this is still good law for New York State, but the employer shall make reasonable efforts to provide a room or other location in close proximity to the work area where an employee can express milk in privacy. The key word there, shall make reasonable, or key phrase, shall make reasonable efforts, means you are not required under the New York State law. Employer is not required to do anything, which is why most of the people on this call might not have a lactation room because you've never had to have one. As of 2 weeks ago, if you're in the city with more than 4 employees, now you have to have the room, you have to have the policy, you always had to provide break time. That was always part of the New York State law, that reasonable breaks must be provided so mothers, or employees, I should say, employees can express breast milk. So other than the written policy, as I just alluded to, the new law requires employers to provide a lactation room that fulfills specific criteria that's set forth in the law and the FAQs that were put out by New York City. I will tell you, in the weeks leading up to March 18th, I received several calls about policies, guidance, and what is an employer to do. And we, as an attorney, as a law firm, provided our best educated guesses as to what New York City was thinking based on some of the intel that we had. But in typical New York City fashion, we did not receive any clear guidance, FAQs, model policies from New York City until late in the day on March 18th, the day that the law was already expected or already took place and was enacted. So compliance was required, yet New York City didn't provide its model materials. Not unusual. If you are providing a lactation room or other accommodations requested by the employee, if those would pose an undue hardship, and we all know the term undue hardship from the New York State Human Rights Law, from the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a similar concept here. It is not an easy threshold. It is not an easy burden to establish undue hardship. Oftentimes I'll hear undue hardship, it is going to be inconvenient. Inconvenient is not an undue hardship. Costing you a little bit extra is generally not an undue hardship. There's tests that we're going to get to that New York City is going to evaluate. It's not a bright line rule. It's not black and white. It's something that requires a totality of the circumstances analysis to determine if something is actually an undue hardship, and it's employer specific on your workforce. No matter what, though, you don't get to just say undue hardship, we can't do it. There is a requirement to engage in this cooperative dialogue, which for any of you who have taken the pleasure of listening to me once a month for the last year plus, probably in late September or October. The law started on October 15th, but late September or October, we talked about the New York City Cooperative Dialogue Law. The importance to that is it's very similar to what the State Human Rights Law, City Human Rights Law, and Americans with Disabilities Act require when it comes to the interactive process. However, it takes it a couple steps further. It requires a writing regarding the accommodations requested and those that were granted and denied by the employer. That writing must be given to the employee, and it basically sets forth more steps in this interactive process, and it kind of guides what the discussion should entail. So, unsurprisingly, New York City taking a law that already exists, expanding upon it, and making it more employee-friendly. So these discussions, what do you have to do as an employer when you know that maybe you have a employee who is going to be needing to take advantage and going to be pumping in the workplace? Should you provide information about your policy? Yes, your policy must be distributed to all of your employees. New employees must get it at the time of hire. Current employees should get a copy. The guidance is not entirely clear on how we are to do that as employers. If you want to work it into a handbook rollout, if you want to work it as a paycheck stuffer or a separate policy distribution blast by email, there's several different ways you can go about it for your current employees. New hires will be pretty easy. You can work it into your new handbook. You can work it as something in your orientation packet. But are you required as an employer to tell employees before they go out to give birth about this or for an adoption? Are you required to tell them about their rights under this law? Not specifically verbally. You have to have the written policy. Should you provide it? Of course, New York City is going to say, yes, you should tell employees about what their rights are when they come back. And you should do it before they come back. So do you have to do it? No. Should you do it? Yes. Would I put it in a policy that we are going to do it and bind an employer to something? Probably not. In the event that we aren't or don't or forget on one occasion to tell an employee. So best practice is, sure, you should tell them, because that will also allow you as an employer to learn if the employee plans on taking advantage of these accommodations, and then maybe you can plan how you're going to manage the workforce when that employee returns. Your requirement to respond when an employee comes to you and says that they are going to need to take advantage of these lactation accommodation, the lactation room and the lactation accommodations that you must offer, you must respond in writing no more than 5 business days after you get that request from the employee. The regulation or the guidance from New York City requires you to respond as quickly as possible. That actually must go in your policy. Break time. So this is something that I am sure many employers already do. You must allow employees time to pump during an already existing rest or meal break, or as an extension of another already existing rest or meal break. You cannot deny them time to pump. You will walk yourself right into a charge of discrimination from the You can imagine either the City Commission on Human Rights or you will have somebody contacting the Department of Labor that they are being denied break time to pump, things that we want to avoid. Employees who pump must be allowed the same quantity and quality of breaks as other employees who have breaks. There's your classic non-discrimination language for lactation. You are to not treat anybody any differently if they need their break for purposes of lactation. So a smoke break, a restroom break, those breaks all equate the same, and we shouldn't treat anybody's break differently depending on the purpose that they're going. If they're going for lactation, they should be provided the same exact rights as everybody else. Employees may need additional breaks to pump and must be provided sufficient breaks to meet their needs. So here's where we're essentially making a little bit of an accommodation already. If more time is needed, you are to provide that time to them, unless you can prove an undue hardship, which again, for breaks where we might be talking about a couple of minutes extra for the employee to do what the employee must do as far as pumping, I will venture to guess that you are going to have a very difficult time establishing an undue hardship. Whether or not they're paid, the breaks are paid depends on the circumstances. If the employee is not completely relieved of all work duty, so if for some reason you're making the employee still work, taking calls, answering emails while pumping, they absolutely must be paid. That's work time. That's not a new revelation. That's something that we should always be doing. People get paid for the time that they work. If the employee is using their regular non-compensable break time to pump, employer must allow them to pump and to reasonably extend the break as needed, and that time need not be paid if it's consistent with how we treat other non-compensable breaks. So again, don't treat lactation breaks any different than we treat other breaks. Written policy. What must be in your policy? So these are the 5 big points that must be in your policy according to New York City frequently asked question guidance. 1, how can an employee contact somebody within the employer to submit a request for a lactation room? That's pretty obvious. Where are we going to send them? Human resources? Is there a certain point of contact? A manager? Obviously, as a best practice, we want all requests going to the same place because we don't want different managers or different supervisors handling or treating requests differently, or maybe somebody not giving them proper attention. If you have one central location, perhaps an HR function, you'd be in better shape to make sure we handle everything consistently and do it in the correct time frame possible, which is what number 2 is. As we said earlier, you must reply to the request as quickly as possible and no later than 5 business days. We move down to number 3, and we'll cover this a little bit more on a couple of slides. What happens when you have 2 or more employees that need to use the same room at the same time? How do we deal with it? So we have to, and you could be somewhat vague in your policy because we don't need to commit to something until we actually face that situation. But there are protocols set forth by the New York City guidance on how we deal with multiple requests at the same time. Number 4 is something, again, that most of you, I will imagine, already have in your policies due to the prior New York State labor law, that employer will provide reasonable break time to express breast milk. And 5, explain that providing all aspects of the lactation room normally required by law will create an undue hardship for the employer. We will engage in a cooperative dialogue to figure out an appropriate accommodation to enable the employee to express breast milk at work. That's your typical catch-all that you're going to throw in at the end of your policy. However, the cooperative dialogue mandate is one that should not be toyed with. You absolutely must engage in it. You absolutely must document your discussions with your employees. What's required of a lactation room? Let's just highlight the big parts. Clean space, other than a restroom, that is shielded from view, free from intrusion from others. That can be a lock, that can be shades. Obviously, your best practice is going to be a lock on the door where people cannot enter the door. If you don't have the ability to put a lock on, I ask that you put a do not disturb sign up. You explain what the purpose of the room is. You don't have to give a whole essay, but you need to make sure it is very clear that the individual using the room can feel that it is protected and that she is not going to be barged in on while using the room. It must have at least one electrical outlet, must have a surface such as a table or a counter where employees can place their breast pump and a chair. So all common things you would expect to be in there. It doesn't need to be the nicest room in the building, but it needs to be clean. It needs to have these items. If it doesn't, you run the risk of violating the law, the city human rights law. Room must be in close proximity. Now, these things don't need to be in the room, but they must be very close. And of course, New York City does not define what close proximity is, but close proximity to running water and a refrigerator to store breast milk. In a perfect world, you would go get a mini fridge or something where people can store rather than having it in the same fridge as people's sandwiches and things that can spill and salad dressings. We don't want things to be contaminated. We should want a very clean fridge that we can maintain, and that could be a very small mini fridge that you plug in very close to the room, or it could be in the room. There's nothing against that as well. Room may be a space available on a temporary basis, so if you don't have a designated one room that's always going to be for lactation, you can use a different space, but we need to make clear that when it's being used for lactation, it is not to be used for any other purpose. We can't provide it. We went over this before. We must engage in this cooperative dialogue if we believe we cannot provide a lactation room. Again, this is a high threshold, so I implore you to try to find a way to provide a lactation room. If you can't, there are ways. If we document that properly and we engage in the cooperative dialogue, which in itself requires some documentation, we can try to establish an undue hardship. So what is the undue hardship analysis? I referred to this earlier. In determining whether an accommodation poses an undue hardship, what we consider. How much is it going to cost us? What's it going to cost us to do what we are saying we can't do? The nature and the cost of the accommodation. The overall financial resources of the facility or facilities involved. So they're going to look at you. You're going to have to look at your books. Can we afford this? Is it going to put us out of business to do this? Is it going to be cost prohibitive for us to do this? What's going to be the effect on our expenses, our resources, and the impact otherwise? The type of operation that we do, maybe for some reason we are unable to provide extra real estate for a room. We don't have the physical constraints. Again, I'm not telling everybody to bring in a contractor and build a new room. I know some employers have taken those steps because it will frankly be somewhat easier to comply than it will be to prove an undue hardship, depending on the circumstances. But we also need to consider how will this affect our workforce? Do we have people who will likely need this? And if we do, the risk of having to prove an undue hardship for each one is difficult, and your exposure could increase. If you have the ability to provide the room, or to provide a room, a conference room, a spare office, something that we can use that can meet all the lactation room requirements, that's what we're looking to do. Other options that the guidance puts out as far as things you could use if you don't have that designated lactation room. These are just some food for thought. Portable lactation space, using an employer vehicle, if we have proper vehicles, depending on the business you engage in. Temporarily assigning changing rooms, manager offices, conference rooms. I know some employers have went the conference room route. Setting up a stall in an employee locker room. Again, cleanliness is paramount here. We want to make sure that we are not putting people in a position where things can get contaminated, or they will not feel safe doing what they are doing. I mentioned earlier what happens when we have 2 or more employees requesting the use of the lactation room at the same time. So the guidance is somewhat open-ended. It says we have to discuss various options with all parties to determine appropriate accommodation that meet all the employees' needs. So what can you do? We could have a login sheet, and we can have the employees talk. We could talk to a group discussion about maybe different times when people could pump, so it could work for everybody. So that way we don't have people using the room at the same time. If the room is big enough, perhaps we are going to put up partitions or screens, something where people using it can obtain the privacy. But that last point, an employee who wishes to pump at their usual workspace shall be permitted to do this so long as it doesn't create an undue hardship for the employer. People who say that bothers me, or other coworkers say this doesn't make me feel very comfortable here, that is not undue hardship, typically. I will say I haven't seen it where it is an undue hardship for somebody saying, oh, that bothers me. Very hard to prove. But understand, although you may not want to frequently advertise it because you want to encourage people to use the lactation room, you cannot prevent an individual from pumping at his or her own workstation unless you can prove an undue hardship. So what happens if you say, oh, New York City, even though I operate there, I have 4 or more employees, I am covered, I don't want to deal with this. What happens to you if you say, I don't want to follow the law? Well, we all know that it's more than a slap on the wrist. It's a violation of the New York City human rights law. And again, you can build up multiple violations here. Not having the lactation room, not providing the break time, not engaging in the cooperative dialogue. Then you can engage in a violation of the cooperative dialogue law by not providing the written documentation at the conclusion of the cooperative dialogue that's required. So what are your penalties? Civil penalties, damages to the individuals who are harmed by your refusal to comply. You would have to change policies. The city commission could come in and require that they train your staff, post a notice. Right now, there is no posting requirement under the lactation law, so they could make you make a posting requirement. And any other affirmative relief that the New York City Human Rights Law and the Commission on Human Rights wants to devise that could be a thorn in your side. So with that, I thank everybody for your time today. Have a wonderful weekend and look forward to speaking to you in April.